The wind howled through the cliffs as I climbed the rocky path leading to my new home, a remote lighthouse perched on the edge of the world. The ocean below churned violently, its waves crashing against the jagged rocks in a chaotic symphony. The isolation was palpable, the air thick with the scent of salt and something else I couldn't quite place, a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I had never been one to seek solitude, but life had a way of pushing people to unexpected places. After losing my job and struggling to keep up with bills, the job at Black Marsh Lighthouse seemed like a godsend. It paid well, required minimal experience, and offered something I desperately needed, a chance to escape. But as I reached the top of the cliff and got my first proper look at the lighthouse, unease crept over me. The structure was taller than I'd imagined, its white paint weathered and peeling. The lantern room at the top glinted faintly in the dying sunlight, but the windows below were dark, like hollow eyes watching my every move. The door to the lighthouse creaked open before I could knock. A man stood in the doorway, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't slept in weeks. "You're the new keeper?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm Will." "You must be Henry," he interrupted. "The manual's inside. Read it. Follow the rules." Before I could ask what he meant, he stepped past me and began descending the path without so much as a backward glance. His silhouette disappeared into the mist, leaving me standing alone at the threshold. The interior of the lighthouse was as gloomy as its exterior. The spiral staircase wound upward, its metal steps rusty and uneven. The walls were lined with shelves crammed full of dusty logs and yellowed maps. A small living area was tucked into the corner, complete with a rickety cot and a stove that looked older than I was. On the kitchen table sat a thick, leather-bound manual with the words Black Marsh Lighthouse. Operating procedures stamped on the cover. Beneath it was a handwritten note, scrawled in shaky penmanship. "Read this carefully. The rules are not optional. They will keep you alive." I frowned, flipping the manual open to the first page. The initial sections were standard fare: how to operate the lantern, log weather conditions, and maintain the equipment. But as I read further, the rules took a bizarre turn. Rule 1. The lantern must remain lit from dusk until dawn. Do not let it go out no matter what. Rule 2. If you hear knocking at the door after midnight, do not answer. Rule 3. Once a week, leave a plate of raw fish outside the back door before sundown. Do not look outside until morning. Rule 4. If the foghorn sounds 3 times in succession, even if the weather is clear, go to the basement immediately and lock the door. Stay there until sunrise. Rule 5. Under no circumstances should. My stomach tightened as I reread the list. The words felt wrong, like they didn't belong in the context of a job manual. Surely this was some kind of joke, an old keeper's way of hazing the new guy. But as I flipped through the remaining pages, I realized the rules weren't presented as suggestions or warnings. They were commands, interspersed with grim notes like, "Failure to follow Rule 1 will result in immediate termination of you, not your employment." A chill ran down my spine. Night fell quickly at Black Marsh, and the lighthouse seemed to transform with the setting sun. Shadows stretched long and deep, creeping into every corner. The sound of the ocean was louder now, almost deafening, as if the waves were trying to drown out something worse. I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The lantern was massive, its glass panels smudged and cracked. A brass lever controlled the light, which burned with an unnatural brightness once I switched it on. I settled into the chair by the lantern, the manual in my lap, and tried to convince myself that everything was normal. But then the knocking started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the roar of the ocean. 3 sharp raps, spaced evenly apart, as though whoever or whatever was outside was patient. I froze, my mind racing. It was barely past midnight, and I hadn't seen anyone else for miles. My first instinct was to grab the flashlight and head for the door, but the rules flashed in my mind like a warning sign. Do not answer. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the manual tighter. Just ignore it, I whispered to myself. It's probably the wind, but the sound didn't stop. It continued for hours, sometimes shifting from the front door to the side windows, as if something was circling the lighthouse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the shadows just beyond the glass were alive, waiting for me to make a mistake. By the time dawn broke, the knocking had stopped, but the unease remained, settling over me like a heavy blanket. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. My entire body was tense, every nerve on edge. I stumbled down to the kitchen, desperate for coffee, and stopped cold. The back door was open. A trail of wet footprints led from the threshold to the center of the room, where they stopped abruptly. The footprints were large, almost animalistic, with elongated toes that ended in sharp points. My stomach churned as I followed them, my heart hammering in my chest. They didn't lead to the front door or any of the windows. They simply stopped, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I grabbed the manual, flipping to the section on Rule 3. The note beneath it was scrawled in Henry's shaky handwriting. Do not forget the offering. If you miss it, they will come inside. I hadn't left out the fish. Panic clawed at my throat as I searched the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. I could feel the weight of something unseen, something wrong. The lighthouse creaked and groaned as the wind picked up outside, the sound unnervingly like a low moan. I clutched the manual to my chest, my mind racing. Was it already too late? You ever go outside after dark? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd broken Rule 3. I hadn't left the offering of raw fish at the back door. Now, something had entered the lighthouse. The wet footprints mocked me, their unnatural shape a grim reminder of my mistake. They stopped in the center of the kitchen, but the air was heavy, as if whatever had left them was still lurking, unseen but close. I couldn't stay here. Grabbing the manual and a flashlight, I bolted upstairs, my footsteps echoing in the spiraling stairwell. I needed to be in the lantern room, high above the darkness, where I could see everything. The lantern room was eerily quiet when I arrived. The light still burned, casting long beams into the foggy dawn, but the glass panels around the room creaked faintly, as though something was pressing against them. I locked the door behind me and sank into the chair, gripping the manual like a lifeline. I flipped to Rule 4, my hands shaking. The note beneath it was chillingly clear. If you suspect they've entered, you must wait until dawn to act. Do not confront them. They will not leave willingly. The sun was already rising, painting the horizon in faint shades of orange and pink. I told myself I was safe now, but the lighthouse felt different, like a living thing, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 6:02 a.m. The knocking had stopped hours ago, and the footprints hadn't moved. Maybe the thing that had come inside was gone. Just as the thought crossed my mind, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a whisper. It came from somewhere below, deep in the bowels of the lighthouse. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like nails dragging across stone. It grew louder, more distinct, as though something was moving slowly, deliberately, through the lower levels. My mind raced. The manual didn't explain what to do if something was inside, only that I wasn't supposed to confront it. But how was I supposed to ignore it when it was creeping through the place I was supposed to call home? The sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. I stayed in the lantern room until the sun was fully up, the light streaming through the fog and bathing the lighthouse in an eerie, golden glow. Only then did I work up the courage to go back downstairs. The kitchen was just as I'd left it, except for one detail. The footprints were gone. I stared at the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. The damp, clawed tracks had vanished completely, leaving no trace that they'd ever been there. My first thought was relief. Maybe it had left. Maybe I was safe. But as I turned to leave, my eyes caught something glinting on the table. It was the plate I'd forgotten to leave out the night before, and sitting in the center of it was a single blackened fishbone. The rest of the day passed in a haze of paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in the lighthouse seemed darker, the air heavier. Every creak of the old building sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to focus on the manual, reading and rereading the rules until they were etched into my mind. I wouldn't make another mistake. When dusk fell, I climbed back to the lantern room and lit the light, making sure it burned as brightly as possible. The manual was clear. Rule 1 was the most important. The lantern must remain lit from dusk until dawn. The night dragged on, every second stretching into eternity. The sound of the waves was deafening, the lighthouse swaying slightly with each gust of wind. I was starting to drift off when I heard it again, the knocking. 3 sharp raps echoed through the lighthouse, each one deliberate, measured. My stomach twisted into knots as I clutched the manual, the words flashing in my mind. Do not answer. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from the walls. I pressed my ear against the cold metal, my breath hitching. The sound wasn't a knock exactly. It was more like scratching, as though something was trying to claw its way inside. The scratching moved, circling the room, growing louder and more frantic. I backed away, my eyes darting to the door. The light was still on, the lantern burning bright, but the shadows seemed to shift and twist just beyond its reach. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a dark shape moving through the fog outside the window. But as I stared, it became clearer. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements jerky and disjointed. It stopped just outside the glass, its face, or what I assumed was its face, pressing against the window. Its features were indistinct, as though its skin was made of smoke, but its eyes burned like coals, fixed directly on me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The manual's rules ran through my mind, but none of them accounted for this. The thing raised one elongated hand and tapped on the glass, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. Grabbing the manual, I bolted down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The air grew colder with every step, the shadows seeming to reach for me as I passed. When I reached the kitchen, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, trying to collect myself. That's when I heard it, a voice, low and rasping, whispering my name. Well, it was coming from the basement. The manual had been clear about Rule 4. If the foghorn sounds 3 times in succession, go to the basement and lock the door. But there hadn't been any foghorn. Still, the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Will, come down. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave the lighthouse and never look back. But I couldn't. I was trapped, bound by the rules and the isolation. Gripping the flashlight, I turned toward the basement door. The air grew colder, heavier, as I descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. At the bottom, I stopped. The basement was pitch black, the flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. And in the center of the room stood a figure, its back turned to me. It was Henry, or at least it looked like him. Henry, I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Its shoulders were hunched, its arms hanging limply at its sides. Slowly, it began to turn, its movements unnatural, like a puppet on strings. When it faced me, I realized with horror that it wasn't Henry. Its face was wrong, twisted and contorted, its features barely human. Its eyes glowed faintly like embers, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. Leave the light on, it rasped, its voice a grotesque mimicry of Henry's. And then it lunged. The thing lunged at me with a speed and ferocity I hadn't thought possible. Its movements were erratic, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the stairwell and barely catching myself on the railing. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the ground and plunging the basement into near-total darkness. Leave the light on, it rasped again, the words twisted and mocking. I scrambled up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing's footsteps echoed behind me, heavy and deliberate, as if it wanted me to know it was following. When I reached the kitchen, I slammed the basement door shut and twisted the lock. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, waiting for the inevitable pounding. But it never came. Instead, there was silence, thick, suffocating silence. I grabbed the manual with trembling hands, flipping through its pages for something, anything, that might explain what I'd just seen. My eyes landed on a section I hadn't noticed before, buried toward the back of the book. Rule 6. If you encounter a figure that resembles a past keeper, do not engage. They are not who they appear to be. Avoid the basement until the next dawn. The manual seemed almost sentient, answering questions I hadn't even known I needed to ask. But this new rule only added to my growing sense of dread. If that thing wasn't Henry, then what was it? And why was it here? The lighthouse felt alive, its walls groaning as if under immense pressure. The lantern room's light still burned brightly, casting beams that sliced through the thick fog outside. But even the light seemed dimmer now, as if the thing in the basement had drained some of its power. I paced the kitchen, my thoughts racing. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to survive the night. The manual's rules had kept me alive so far, even if they made no sense. All I could do was follow them. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 2 a.m., hours stretched between me and dawn, an eternity in this place. Then the knocking started again. It came from the front door this time, 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, just like the first night. I froze, my mind flashing back to the first rule I'd broken. I hadn't forgotten the fish this time. I'd left it out at sundown, as instructed. So why was it still knocking? The knocks grew louder, more insistent, and then they moved, shifting to the windows, the walls, the ceiling. It felt like the lighthouse was surrounded, besieged by unseen forces that wanted in. I clutched the manual tighter, scanning its pages for guidance, but nothing I read brought comfort. Will? The voice was back, slithering through the cracks in the walls. It wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was everywhere. "Let me in," it whispered. My grip on the manual tightened. "No," I muttered under my breath, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. "Will," the voice crooned, softer now, almost pleading. "Don't you want to know the truth? Don't you want to know why you're really here?" The words sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't thought much about why Black Marsh Lighthouse had been so desperate for a new keeper. The pay was high, the job remote, the requirements minimal. It had seemed too good to be true, and now I was starting to see why. "What do you mean?" I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The voice chuckled, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Open the door, and I'll show you." I backed away from the door, shaking my head. "No," I said again, louder this time. The chuckling stopped, replaced by a low growl. The air grew colder, the light from the lantern flickering as if struggling against some unseen force. "You can't ignore me forever, Will," the voice hissed. "You're already mine?" The words sent a jolt of fear through me, but they also sparked something else: anger. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen table, its beam cutting through the darkness as I moved toward the spiral staircase. If the rules were the only thing keeping me alive, then I needed to follow them to the letter. The lantern room was my sanctuary, the one place where the light burned bright enough to keep the shadows at bay. I climbed the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty lighthouse. But when I reached the top, I froze. The lantern had gone out. Panic set in as I fumbled with the controls, trying to relight the massive lamp. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the matches, the small box tumbling across the floor. The darkness pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. The fog outside the windows seemed to writhe, shapes moving within it that I couldn't quite make out. The manual's warning echoed in my mind. The lantern must remain lit from dusk until dawn. Do not let it go out, no matter what. My fingers finally found the matches, and I struck one, the tiny flame of fragile beacon in the oppressive dark. I lit the lantern, and the room was flooded with light once more. But the relief was short-lived. The light revealed something I hadn't noticed before: handprints. They were smeared across the windows, long and thin, as though something had pressed against the glass, watching me. The growling started again, louder this time, coming from the walls themselves. The lighthouse shook, the metal staircase rattling like a cage. I clutched the manual, flipping to the next section. My eyes landed on a single, cryptic line. Sometimes, the rules change. The growling grew louder, the light flickering once more. I backed away from the lantern, my heart racing. The handprints on the glass seemed to multiply, spreading like a disease across the windows. I was running out of time. Suddenly, the foghorn blared, 3 deafening blasts that shook the entire lighthouse. The manual fell from my hands, the words of rule for flashing in my mind. If the foghorn sounds 3 times in succession, go to the basement immediately and lock the door. Stay there until sunrise. But the thing from the basement was still down there. I was trapped, caught between the rules and the nightmare they'd unleashed. The blaring of the foghorn reverberated through the lighthouse, shaking it to its very foundation. Each blast was like a countdown, urging me toward the one place I dreaded most, the basement. The manual had been explicit. When the foghorn sounds 3 times, the basement was the only sanctuary. But how could that be true when I'd already seen the thing that lurked down there? My instinct screamed to stay in the lantern room, where the light still burned, but the foghorn wasn't just a sound, it was a command. I had no choice. The spiral staircase groaned under my weight as I descended, the flashlight beam trembling in my hands. The air grew colder the farther down I went, the walls slick with condensation that smelled faintly of salt and decay. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. My reflection in the small, dirty window seemed distorted, the features subtly wrong, just enough to make my skin crawl. I steeled myself, gripping the doorknob tightly. The basement was a void, the darkness thicker than it should have been, as though it were alive, waiting to swallow me whole. I stepped inside, the flashlight's narrow beam barely cutting through the gloom. I shut the door behind me and locked it, the metallic click echoing through the oppressive silence. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and every instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. Will, the voice was back, louder now, more insistent. It came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around me like a cold mist. Why do you fight it? I didn't respond. Instead, I pressed my back against the wall, the flashlight shaking as I scanned the room. The thing that had mimicked Henry wasn't here. Not yet. The foghorn's blasts had stopped, but the silence they left behind was worse. It felt loaded, pregnant with anticipation. The manual's rules had saved me so far, but now I questioned their purpose. They felt less like guidelines for survival and more like the twisted whims of something playing with me, testing how far I would go to obey. The voice laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my stomach churn. You think the rules will save you, it hissed. They're not for you. They're for us. The words chilled me to the core. Before I could process them, the flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering before plunging me into darkness. My breathing quickened as I fumbled for the spare batteries in my pocket. The basement's silence was deafening, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you imagine sounds that aren't there. But then I realized I wasn't imagining them. Footsteps. They were soft at first, almost hesitant, but they grew louder, closer. The flashlight finally sparked back to life, the beam cutting through the dark just in time to catch movement at the edge of the room. Something was there. The figure stepped into the light, and my stomach dropped. It was Henry, or at least it looked like him. Will, he said, his voice a perfect mimicry of the man I'd replaced. You don't have to be afraid. I backed away, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. You're not Henry, I said, my voice trembling. The thing smiled, its lips stretching too far across its face. Does it matter? I know why you're here, Will. Don't you want to know? I shook my head, but the thing kept advancing, its movements slow and deliberate. You were chosen, it said, its voice taking on a sinister edge. You think you're just another keeper? No, Will. You're the offering. The words hit me like a freight train. Offering for what? I demanded, my voice rising. The thing laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the basement. For the light, it said simply. For the beacon that keeps them at bay. The realization dawned on me like a punch to the gut. The rules weren't just arbitrary. They were rituals, sacrifices meant to appease whatever forces surrounded this cursed lighthouse. And I was part of it. The thing lunged faster than I could react. Its clawed hand swiped at me, but I ducked, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and skittering across the floor. Darkness enveloped me, broken only by the faint, otherworldly glow emanating from the thing's eyes. I scrambled backward, my hands searching for anything I could use to defend myself. "Stay in the light, Will," it mocked, its voice dripping with malice. I found the flashlight and swung it wildly, the beam catching the thing's face. It recoiled, letting out a guttural screech as the light burned its smoky features. But the victory was short-lived. The light flickered again, its power fading fast. The basement door rattled violently, the sound cutting through the chaos. Something or someone was trying to get in. "Will," a voice shouted from the other side. It was different from the thing's mocking tone, desperate, human. I hesitated, the flashlight's dying beam shaking in my hands. "Open the door," the voice pleaded. The thing in the basement snarled, its elongated limbs twitching as it prepared to strike again. I made a split-second decision, bolting for the door and unlocking it just as the flashlight went out completely. A figure burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them. In the faint glow of the emergency lantern they carried, I saw a face I didn't recognize. Another man, his features haggard, his clothes soaked from the rain. "You're the new keeper," he said, his voice breathless. "I'm Thomas. I was here before you." The name hit me like a jolt. Thomas had been the keeper before Henry. His name was in the records. But he was supposed to be dead. "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He stared at the basement, his face pale. "You let it in, didn't you?" Before I could respond, the snarling returned, louder this time, echoing from the far corner of the room. The emergency lantern flickered, its light barely holding back the encroaching darkness. "It's feeding off the light," Thomas said, his voice grim. "That's how it gets stronger. We have to stop it." "How?" I asked, panic rising. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened a hidden panel in the wall, revealing a series of switches and levers. "The lighthouse isn't just a beacon," he said, his voice low. "It's a prison. But to keep it contained, we need to make a choice." The snarling grew louder, the thing's shadow stretching across the room as it advanced. "What choice?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Thomas turned to me, his expression haunted. "Either we seal it away for another keeper to deal with, or we destroy the lighthouse." Destroy the lighthouse. The thought was unthinkable, but as I stared at the thing approaching us, its twisted form barely held back by the flickering light, I realized there might not be another option. Thomas's hand hovered over a lever. "Decide, Will," he said. "We don't have much time." The thing lunged again, its claws inches from my face. I grabbed the lantern and swung it, the light flaring brightly for a moment before dimming once more. "Well," Thomas shouted, "now or never." I looked at the lever, my mind racing. Could I condemn someone else to this nightmare? Or was I ready to end it all, even if it meant my own death? The basement roared with the sound of the creature's growls, its twisted form moving closer, the dim light of the lantern barely keeping it at bay. Thomas stood by the panel, his hand trembling over the lever. Every second stretched into eternity, the weight of the decision crushing me. "Well, we don't have time," Thomas shouted, his voice strained with desperation. My mind raced, torn between survival and destruction. If we destroyed the lighthouse, we would rid the world of this cursed prison. But at what cost? Would the thing escape? And if I left it contained, I'd be damning another poor soul to endure the same torment. The creature lunged. I swung the lantern instinctively, the glass shattering as it struck the thing's face. The light flared brightly for a fleeting second, illuminating the horror in full. Its face was a twisted amalgamation of features. Henry's eyes, my own mouth, Thomas's scars, all writhing together as though trying to decide which identity to wear. The creature howled and recoiled, its claws raking across the walls, leaving deep gashes that oozed darkness. The shattered lantern's oil spilled across the floor, and the faint flame, still flickering inside, began to spread. "Will, you have to decide now." Thomas's voice cut through the chaos. I turned to him, my chest heaving. "What happens if we destroy it?" Thomas's face darkened. "The lighthouse collapses. The thing loses its anchor and fades. At least that's the theory. But we won't survive. And if we're wrong," he didn't need to finish the sentence. The creature recovered, its form shifting again. This time, it wore my face entirely, grinning with a malice that felt deeply personal. "Will," it whispered, its voice a perfect imitation of mine, "you can't kill me. I'm you, and you're me. We're the same." The words struck a nerve, their meaning gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The manual's cryptic instructions, the strange familiarity I felt with this place. It all began to fall into place. "You've always been part of this," the creature hissed. "You think you were chosen randomly? You think you're just another keeper? No, Will. You're mine." I shook my head, stepping back. "No, you're lying." But deep down, I wasn't sure. Thomas shouted something, but the creature's voice drowned him out, slithering into my ears like a poison. "Pull the lever, and you'll only set me free," it taunted. "Seal me away, and I'll wait. Either way, you lose." The fire was spreading, creeping closer to the oil-soaked walls. Smoke began to fill the basement, stinging my eyes and choking my lungs. Thomas grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the panel. "Don't listen to it," he yelled. "It's trying to break you. It thrives on doubt." But the creature laughed, a guttural sound that resonated in my bones. "And what makes you think he isn't lying? You've seen the manual, Will. Sometimes the rules change." I looked at Thomas, then at the creature. The lever loomed before me, its metal gleaming in the dim firelight. My hand hovered over it, sweat dripping down my brow. "What if it's right?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Thomas grabbed me by the shoulders, forcing me to look at him. "This thing is evil," he said, his eyes wide with urgency. "It's been trapped here for decades, maybe centuries. If we don't end this now, it will only keep growing stronger. You know what you have to do." The fire crackled louder, the heat becoming unbearable. The creature lunged again, its claws swiping inches from my face. I made my choice. With a final, determined breath, I pulled the lever. The lighthouse groaned, its walls trembling as though the entire structure were alive. The fire roared, consuming the oil and spreading faster than seemed possible. The creature let out a deafening scream, its form writhing and distorting, its human features melting away to reveal something far more monstrous. The light in the lantern room above flared brilliantly, casting beams that pierced through the fog outside. For a moment, it was as if the entire world was bathed in an unearthly glow. The creature howled, its body disintegrating into tendrils of shadow that were pulled toward the light. Thomas grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the basement stairs. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, but I knew it was too late. The lighthouse was collapsing, its very foundation crumbling beneath us. As we stumbled up the stairs, the walls began to buckle, the sound of groaning metal and splintering would filling the air. The light in the lantern room continued to burn, impossibly bright, until it finally exploded in a blinding flash. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the rocky shore, the wreckage of the lighthouse scattered around me. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear, star-filled sky. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. I sat up, my body aching, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The manual was gone, the creature's voice silenced. But as I looked out at the horizon, I saw a faint glow in the distance, a new light, faint but growing stronger. I don't know if we succeeded or if the creature found another anchor, another way to survive. All I know is that the rules of Black Marsh Lighthouse were never meant to protect me. They were meant to protect it. And now, someone else will have to face the darkness.